I want to take you back in time, 16 years to be precise. It's April the 20th, 2010. We're about 40 miles off the coast of Louisiana in the Gulf of Mexico on a large offshore drilling rig. It's a complex, technical, high-pressure environment, highly regulated, full of procedures, permits, dashboards, controls, audits, specialist expertise, and highly experienced people. And here's the detail that really matters. On that very day, the crew were reportedly marking a remarkable safety milestone. 7 years without a reported lost time injury. 7 years. On paper, that looks like success. On a dashboard, that looks like safety. In a leadership meeting, that looks like something to celebrate. And then the rig exploded. 11 people died, 17 more hospitalized with life-threatening injuries. The rig burned for more than a day before sinking. The oil spill continued for 87 days, and the human, environmental, reputational, and financial consequences were immense. The operator of the rig, BP, their share price plummeted. It took years to regain anything close to its previous value. The event made global headlines, and it was even later turned into a major Hollywood film. The rig, of course, was Deepwater Horizon. And for me, the haunting lesson of Deepwater Horizon is this. It's that the absence of accidents does not prove the presence of safety. Just because nothing's been reported doesn't mean nothing's going wrong. It might simply mean that the organization has lost the ability or the willingness to hear the truth. And that distinction matters enormously. Because organizations can become very good at measuring the absence of something. No injuries, no incidents, no complaints, no bad news. But the absence of bad news is not the same as the presence of good culture. Deepwater Horizon is not just a story about oil and gas. It's not even just a story about safety. It's a story about silence, about pressure, about culture, and especially about false confidence. The deeper question is rarely just what rule was broken. The deeper question needs to be what was known, sensed, worried about, normalized, or suspected, but not heard clearly enough, early enough, or seriously enough. And for me, that's where leadership really matters. Because if a culture teaches people to stay quiet, to defer, to avoid being difficult, to trust the dashboard more than lived reality, or to celebrate the absence of reported injury while ignoring the presence of risk, then the organization becomes truly blind. And blindness destroys value. It destroys lives. It destroys trust. It destroys reputation. And it destroys the future. Now let's rewind back a little more to October 1987. We're in a Manhattan hotel ballroom. Paul O'Neill has recently become CEO of Alcoa, one of America's great industrial companies. He's standing before Wall Street investors and analysts. Now, of course, people expect the usual CEO language: margins, cost reductions, restructuring, earnings, growth. Instead, O'Neill talks about worker safety. Not as a side issue, not as compliance, not as a moral paragraph at the end of a strategy document. He makes it front and central. He says, in effect, I want Alcoa to become the safest company in America. Now, some investors were puzzled. Some were probably alarmed. They'd come to hear how the new CEO would improve financial performance, and here he is talking about worker injury. But O'Neill understood something many leaders still miss today. And this is vitally important. The idea of truly caring is not some new or novel idea that I've just invented. Some leaders have always understood it. Some leaders just get it. O'Neill got it. He understood that if you want to understand how an organization really works, you've got to look at what happens when a person gets hurt. Because an injury is never just an injury. It tells you something about communication. It tells you something about maintenance. It tells you something about supervision. It tells you something about pressure. It tells you something about whether people speak up. And it tells you something about whether leaders listen. So safety becomes a doorway into the whole operating system of the organization. If someone was injured, leaders need to know quickly. If something was unsafe, people need to be able to say so. If a process was broken, it had to be fixed. If people had ideas, they had to be heard. And for me, that's care with operational discipline. Not care as sentiment, but care as a way of running the business. And so what happened at Alcoa? Safety improved. So did communication and learning and operations and business performance improved too. O'Neill was not choosing safety over performance. He was using care as the pathway to performance. And that, for me, is the heart of a culture that really cares. I've shared two stories. One shows what happens when an organization cannot hear reality quickly enough. And the other story shows what happens when care becomes operational, when it shapes what leaders ask, what people say, what the organization learns, and how quickly it acts. And those two stories boil down to just 6 words. Silence destroys value. Care creates value. And for me, that's why this conversation about creating value wins matters so much. Because value is not created by slogans. It's not created by dashboards. It's not created by extracting more and more and more from people. Value is created when leaders build the climate, the culture, and the conditions where people can think clearly, speak honestly, collaborate well, and do meaningful work. And that's where people win. That's where teams win. That's where organizations win. And ultimately, that's where society wins. So for me, care is not the opposite of performance. Care is the climate in which sustainable performance becomes possible, and everyone wins.
Thank you, Andrew. And I see you can see why Andrew is one of the world's leading experts in safety, in caring, and in value creation. His 30 years of experience is as a professor, as a CEO, as a holder of institutional positions, and even more recently as a young father of 2 children, aged 2 and 3. So he is getting new lessons in how to undertake caring, a lesson that I'm learning as a new grandfather with a 2-year-old daughter. And in fact, the process of learning about caring is something that is a continuing learning process. But now we are going to hear more insights from Andrew very shortly. But let me first turn to our segment, Breaking News. Our breaking news today comes from actually a slide that Felix Oberholz on in the second episode of our thing showed, which is one of his great discoveries of the structure of the S&P 500. This is the 10-year rate of return on invested capital of the 500 firms in the S&P 500. And you'll see that, to his surprise, and my surprise when I first saw it, is that most of the firms are bunched in the left-hand, low-performing and below-average performance. And there are just a few firms, 30% of the firms, which are much, much, much more productive than those firms. And what is even more striking is that when you look into these, the dots, and see who is doing what, in fact, these firms on the left-hand end are practicing traditional management, top-down hierarchy, whereas the firms on the right-hand, the firms that are racing ahead, are high-value creating firms that are being run very, very differently. So the question I got from one of our participants was, well, Steve, it would be much easier to understand what the slide was about if you just show which of those dots are in which sector. Then we could actually see what's really going on in these firms. And we actually had a segment on CNBC, the financial news, this week addressing the same question. And the answer to that was these firms on the left, it's true, they are actually in sectors and they are seeing themselves as competing with other firms in those sectors, agriculture, industry, high tech. And the firms on the right-hand side are not doing that at all. The firms on the right-hand side are not focused on a single sector and looking at over their shoulder at their competitor. They are focused on creating value for customers. And you find that when they're successful doing that, like Apple and Amazon and Alphabet and NVIDIA, that they are not in one sector, they're in 3, 4, 5 sectors. So it makes no sense to talk about them being leaders in their sector. When you look at the overall what's happening in the economy, that this is a whole new economy. The firms on the right are creating something that is radically different from what is happening in those firms on the left. And what is also happening is that they are dragging the firms on the left into the right, into this new economy. If you're a firm in this traditional mode and you have a logistics challenge, does it make sense to try to improve your mediocre logistics, or does it make sense to actually work with Amazon, which has the world's leading global logistics structure? And what is happening is that firms are increasingly doing that, working with these value-creating firms. And that is why, even at a time when the price of oil is rising globally, quite astonishingly, the stock market is, in fact, growing exponentially because this economy on the right-hand side, it's not a bubble. It's actually creating value for the firms. And so we'll be looking into aspects of this throughout this podcast series. But we are going to turn now to some specific questions. And in particular, Andrew, I'd like to ask you, you've had a long career dealing with all sorts of different companies. You've dealt with racing cars, you've dealt with oil companies, you've dealt with every kind of company. Could you tell us what was the most surprising discovery in all this research?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. So the research I think you're referring to is for my new book called Who Cares Wins, The Psychological Science of Transformational Leadership, which I wrote with my great friend, Dr. E. Scott Geller, who's recently retired after 56 years of teaching psychology at Virginia Tech. The research that I suppose came out for us there is really twofold. First, a change in scope for me. I've spent nearly 30 years working around the domains of safety culture and safety leadership with multinational organizations in more than 130 countries. And so I suppose what this book is doing, and it's, I think, my 10th or 11th book now, the previous one's focused on culture and leadership, and this one is doing that, but it's not talking about safety. It's talking about this idea of a culture of care. So it's a scope change rather than a direction change. And that's deliberate because in my opening story about Deepwater Horizon, I argued that the absence of accidents doesn't prove the presence of safety. And I should be clear here that this learning is not unique to BP and Deepwater Horizon. In fact, over the last 3 decades, I've seen this false confidence in hundreds of organizations around the world, from energy to construction, FMCG to tech, every industry sector. And so my earlier work prior to this book was about helping organizations move from measuring failure to instead creating safety, small, disciplined improvements that compound over time. In this new book, Who Cares Wins, we realized that the same principle applies far beyond safety. Now, I mentioned Scott Geller. Scott brings decades, 5+ decades of behavioral science and his pioneering work on actively caring for people. And I bring about 3 decades of work with leaders and teams on the front lines in complex, high-pressure organizations. And so the book sits at that intersection, science and practice. And so the big discovery for me in researching for this book is that care is not a soft sentiment. care is a performance system. When you step back, leadership is really about creating the conditions where people can perform at their best. And so what we found both in the research and in practice is that organizations don't outperform because they have the most control. They outperform because people can think clearly, speak up, challenge constructively. They can learn, they can decide, and they can act with confidence. And so that was the most powerful discovery, that the care doesn't slow organizations down. Care removes the friction that slows organizations down.
And you've been working with many companies in many sectors over these 30 years, and you have encountered companies like BP who are not paying attention to us. Could you give us, if when you're invited into such a company, what is the single most effective tactic that you have adopted that has been successful in shaking them out of their wrong perception of things and actually starting to adopt this different way of creating value for their customers?
That's an interesting question. I'm being asked that quite a lot at the moment in keynotes, and also particularly at one of the business schools that I teach at. Someone asked me just a week ago, what's the most important leadership skill right now, in my view? And somebody, I'll tell them the same answer. I think the single most effective tactic is getting leaders to recover the art and skill of curiosity. Now, that might sound simple, but I think it's becoming one of the most important leadership capabilities of our time. And I believe it's going to become more important with the advent of tech, AI, and everything else that's happening in the world right now. And I think it's particularly important because we've almost outsourced curiosity to search engines and to generative AI. We type in a question, we get an answer back straight away, and we move on. But human curiosity is different. Human curiosity is relational. It's about asking another person, what are you seeing here? What are you experiencing? What do you know that I don't? What are we missing? How do you think we can do this better? And in command and control cultures, leaders often ask questions that are really disguised orders. They ask things like, did you follow the process? Why did this happen? Who's accountable? Now, these leaders might think they've moved on from Taylorism, but actually these questions are perfect classic command and control. Of course, they have their place, but they often create defensiveness. And so I think the shift is towards questions that unlock intelligence. That's where we create value wins. Questions like, where is the risk building up? What would make this task easier, smarter, or safer? What have we learned that we should carry forward? And to kind of illustrate this, let me kind of just pick on some of the sectors that I've been working in. In Formula One, you need speed and precision. In the energy sector, you need people willing to speak up before a weak signal becomes a major incident. In FMCG, where execution and supply chains move quickly, you need alignment, clarity, and fast decision-making. And so in all of those environments, the leadership move is the same. It's shifting from control-based leadership to curiosity-based leadership, and then backing it up with everyday behaviors, listening properly, modeling openness, recognizing contribution, following through on concerns, and creating some simple rituals where people can talk about what's really happening. Because for me, curiosity is not just a mindset, it's an active behavior. And when leaders are genuinely curious, they do two things at once. They maintain discipline, but they also unlock intelligence. And so in the book, we argue that care-based leadership is not being nice instead of being rigorous. It's about creating the conditions where people are willing and able to contribute what they know.
Thanks very much. And one of my colleagues, Doug, now has a question for you. Doug?
Yeah, thanks, Steve, and thanks, Andrew. So your last answer, Andrew, made me curious why more leaders aren't more curious about the real important, impactful impacts of psychological safety and emotional intelligence, and often dismiss those concepts as soft. So drawing on your presidency with the Institute of Occupational Safety and Health and your work in high hazard sectors like mining and energy, what hard evidence have you seen that a culture of care delivers measurable return on investment in safety, productivity, retention, and other metrics?
Yeah, look, Don, that's a fascinating question. And I get the skepticism, particularly in high hazard sectors. But I often say what people call soft skills are often the hardest skills to develop and sustain. Listening well under pressure is hard. Staying curious, truly curious when something's gone wrong is hard. Creating the conditions where people feel able to speak up is hard. Being consistent, visible, and trustworthy over time is hard. But the evidence is very clear. In organizations where care is genuinely embedded, not as a slogan, not as some words on a wall, but as a set of consistent behaviors, you see it in reduced absenteeism. You see it in improved safety performance. You see it in faster project delivery. You see it in enhanced productivity, higher retention rates, and stronger operational performance across the board. And let's be clear, these are not trade-offs. I'm not talking about one or the other. They come from the same mechanism. When people feel safe to speak up, you surface problems earlier and solve them faster. So what's often labeled as soft is actually enabling something very hard, and that's better execution. So the aim is not to create a nicer organization in some vague sense. It's to move from compliance-driven operations to care-driven operations, where care shows up in how people listen, decide, challenge, learn, and follow through. And Marshall Goldsmith, who wrote the foreword for our book, Who Cares Wins, says this is about becoming more human. I think I might take that step one further and say that I think becoming more human is a strategic advantage.
Thank you very much. I think my colleague Hunter can take the baton from here.
Yeah, so let me build on that, Andrew, because I find that very inspiring and exciting. I claim to be the economist in this group, and I see an economic premise there that the primary concern of the firm is the human experience. And that requires, as you've alluded to, a much different approach to business. It includes a empathetic, subjective, qualitative understanding of the emotions of customers and the emotions of employees. And I agree with you. I find a potential for competitive advantage there. In fact, it's the only source of competitive advantage. But it's the opposite of the paradigm that we're taught about business, which is about quantification. It's about numbers, and it's about hitting goals and targets and so on. And I would say that the quantitative focus has removed the human experience from business. So I'm going to make a statement and then ask you a question. So my statement is, you have rejected the entire premise on which we've all been taught to think about business for the last 100 years. And second, do you see any evidence of that? Do you have good evidence that it's working for anybody anywhere, since it's the opposite of the old paradigm?
Hunter, that was very interesting. You said that you had a question for me, but I think there was about 10 in there. So I'm going to see if I can pick around the edges of that and come up with some responses that might be helpful. You introduced yourself as the economist in the room. So let's start there. And this might be a bit uncomfortable, what I'm about to say, but I mean it very respectfully. Over the last 3 decades, I've supported clients in 206 fatal accidents in their workplaces around the world. Each one of those touches my heart deeply and causes deep pain, but it also reinforces a need, a sense of urgency to support and to drive a change in around how leaders think about what they think is safety. And here's the bit that might be uncomfortable. Beyond the moral imperative, beyond the human lives that are affected through accidents in the workplace, there is an economic hit, and it is huge. The latest data tells us that each lost time accident, which could be a couple of days absent from work, recovering and then coming back, costs somewhere between 200,000 and 500,000 US dollars. Immediate bottom line cost, up to $500,000 per accident. Each fatal accident in the workplace costs between 3 and 5 million. Now, you take an organization, a large multinational corporate, might be having 1 or 2 or 300 lost time accidents a year, might be having 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 fatals. You start to put the maths together and you see that the immediate impact on the business is significant, multiple millions of dollars. But that's not where the economical calculation ends. In order to cover the cost of poor safety, the total figure that we've just calculated, you need to think about the margins of the business. You've got to think about how much more you've got to sell in order to cover that cost of poor safety. And so there is a definite economic advantage to having a culture of care. But let me kind of move forward on that a little bit more. And the first thing that I want to say is that the subjective understanding of all of this doesn't mean vague understanding. It means getting close enough to the lived experience of the customer or the employee or the patient or the frontline worker to really understand what matters before you reduce it to a number. Now, of course, numbers matter. As Drucker said, you can't manage it if you can't measure it. But I think numbers often tell us what's happening after the fact. And human experience helps us understand why it's happening and what to do about it. So one example I can speak about in general terms comes from work with organizations where the customer experience was being measured heavily, but not truly understood. They had dashboards, survey scores, satisfaction metrics, operational KPIs, all useful stuff, but leaders were still looking at the customer through the organization's lens. And the shift came when they slowed down and asked simply, what is the customer actually trying to feel here? What anxiety are they trying to reduce? What confidence are they looking for? Where are we making their life harder rather than easier? And I think that's where empathy becomes economic. Because once leaders understood the emotional experience, not just the transaction, they could redesign moments of contact, simplify processes, remove friction, and equip their people to respond with more judgment and more care. And the gains came because the organization stopped trying merely to serve the process and instead started serving the person. And that's true whether you're in luxury goods, technology, healthcare, aviation, energy, everywhere. The point is this: value is created when organizations understand human experience deeply enough to remove the friction and create confidence. And that's why care matters commercially. It's not sentimentality, it's how you understand what people value and then build the organization around that.
Perfect. We agree. We economists agree with that, or at least some of us do, Andrew. So thank you.
I'm pleased to hear that, and relieved too. Thanks, Hunter.
Thank you, Hunter and Andrew. And now for a change of pace, we're going to go to our weekly segment, The World's Dumbest Management Idea. There are a lot of not very intelligent ideas out there, and you've been hearing some of them already today. And we, as you've been following this podcast series, we've asked each week the speaker to look at all of the dumb management ideas out there and pick which is truly the dumbest. And interestingly, when we asked Rita and Felix and Johan, which was the truly dumbest management idea, they each gave a different one. They each found new depths of stupidity. So we're going to ask again to our speaker today, Andrew. Andrew, what is truly the world's dumbest management idea?
I think the world's dumbest management idea, Steve, is that people are our greatest asset. Now, I know it's usually said with good intention, but I think the language reveals the problem. Assets are things we own. things we manage, things we deploy, things we sweat, depreciate, and extract value from. And people are not assets. People are human beings. In fact, that reminds me of something the late Charles Handy said to me several years ago. Charles was a great mentor of mine. We were sitting having lunch one day in his home in London. And I asked him, what would you most like to change about the world of work? And he looked at me whilst having a sandwich and just said, HR. I said, you'd like to change HR? And he smiled that beautiful little wisdom-filled smile and said, yeah, I change HR to RH. And I thought, what is he talking about? And he said, I don't mean we should say human resources. Instead, I propose we should say resourceful humans. And I've never forgotten that because it completely changes the starting point. If we see people as resources, we ask, how do we use them more efficiently? But if we see people as resourceful humans, instead we ask, how do we create the conditions where their intelligence, creativity, judgment, care, and energy can come alive? And for me, that's the heart of Who Cares Wins. And I think it's also why what you're doing, creating value wins, resonates so strongly with me. That value is not created by extracting more from people. Value is created when leaders build the climate, the culture, and the conditions where people can do great work and thrive while doing it. So the world's dumbest management idea is that people are our greatest asset. I think I'd replace that with, we'll create value when the conditions allow them to be fully human, fully engaged, and fully resourceful. I think that's how leaders, teams, organizations, customers, and ultimately society win.
We will, in fact, be having more discussions about what has been called HR and looking not only at how you actually treat human beings as human beings, but also the language that traps us, that trips us up. Because I think when someone was saying that people are our greatest asset, I think the speaker probably intended, meant well by using that phrase, they are assets, but he stumbled into language that is common in organizations. And so we will be systematically identifying language that forces organizations almost to stay in this old paradigm and identifying language that we never want to hear human beings being referred as assets.
I think this is really important. Just a quick immediate thought. We both said that leaders that say people are our greatest asset probably have the right intention. Sure they do. Let's be optimistic here. But there's a huge difference between intention and impact. And it's not just in HR. If we go into safety for a minute, most organizations at some point, maybe even now, say safety first. Safety is our top priority. Let's face it, that's bullshit. The top priority for every organization is making money. Bring the economist back in and get his view to tell us what's the most important thing. But of course, saying money first, safety second doesn't sound very people-focused. And so I think leaders have got a bit of work to do to think about a language that they use and the impact that it has for people around them.
Right. And in this podcast series, we will, in fact, be identifying bullshit as bullshit. Unlike many conferences and many management courses and management journals who skate around that kind of issue, in this podcast, you'll be hearing the truth, the things that you don't hear in the other those other forums. But Hunter has another question. Hunter?
Yes, so let me take you back to the economics of empathy. Andrew, you stated it brilliantly well, and I agree with you. So we're talking about an economics of emotion and sympathy. Our favorite economist, Adam Smith, said that the economy runs on love. He said our goal is to be loved and to be lovable, by which he meant we must earn the love that we want our customers and our employees to give us. So you and I are in the same vein there. One of your tools in the book, I'm not sure whether you take this from your professional life, but in Who Cares Wins, is what I called the personal empathy audit. You have reflective questions, philosophical questions to ask oneself about one's humanity and how one exercises it in business. It's a lovely thought. Just to be a little crass, I wonder whether that's scalable to the kind of level where we can make the corporation a caring entity by rolling up all of those individual personal audits. So can you scale that? Do you have any stories about that?
Gosh, I thought the previous question from you was a tough one, but the economics of empathy, I love that phrase. Maybe that's the follow-up book to Who Cares Wins. Look, I think the Beatles were right when they said all you need is love. I think if we loved each other a bit more at home, at work, abroad, I think the world would be a better place. And I love your question too. These I'm particularly pleased that you've picked up on these end of chapter sort of personal self audits or reflections. That's been a habit of mine since my first book about 12 or 13 years ago. And in fact, readers tell me these are the bits that they find quite useful. In fact, I was joking. I was doing some work with Nestle, the food company, recently, and I gave them all a copy of the book. And you could see them looking aghast, thinking, when am I going to have time to read 300 pages? And I said, look, you only have to read 5. There are 5 chapters. If you go to the last page of every chapter, you get this set of reflective questions. You could just read those. And so I think you're pointing at the right thing, that the key is that the self-audit can't remain private reflection only. It has to become a leadership practice, then a team practice, and eventually part of the organization's operating rhythm. And so what I'm noticing in many of our clients is that when I run a workshop at top team level or global top 100s and they get a copy of the book, quite often afterwards, one of the actions that they take is within their leadership teams, they set up a little book club. And at each month's leadership team meeting, a different representative of the leadership team will summarize one of the chapters and then will facilitate a discussion with the rest of the leadership team around those questions that come at the end of the chapter. And the idea, of course, is that everybody on the leadership team has read that particular chapter in advance of the meeting. And in fact, I joined one of these just this morning. I just sat in, I turned up. They didn't know I was coming. They had invited me to them all. So I just turned up and got in there. And the discussion was fantastic. Because one of the things we're really intentional about in Who Cares Wins was creating these moments of reflection. We didn't want the questions to be decorative. We wanted the book to become a working tool. Because I think reading is just part of the value. The real value is created in the critical thinking that follows. And I think a simple personal question like, what is it like to be on the receiving end of me, can become much bigger if a leadership team takes it seriously. At the individual level, it asks, how do I show up as a leader? How do I listen? What happens to people's energy, confidence, and their honesty when I enter the conversation? And at the team level, it becomes, what's it like to be on the receiving end of this leadership team? And at the organizational level, it becomes, what's it like to be our customer, our supplier, our frontline worker, our new start, our most vulnerable colleague? And I think that's where the self-audit becomes a corporate practice. And I mentioned the book club. I've seen this work also where organizations build it into leadership development programs or team reviews or listening sessions or safety conversations or customer experience work and after action learning. And so the point is not to create a one-off moment of introspection, it's to create a recurring discipline of inquiry. And you don't need this book to do that. You know, a useful simple program in an organization might be leaders using reflective questions before major decisions are made, or teams asking, what are we making harder than it needs to be? Or customer facing groups asking, what does this feel like from the customer's perspective? Or executives reviewing not only performance outcomes, but the climate they're creating. And I think that's how reflection scales, to your point. It starts personally, but it becomes cultural when the questions are repeated, when they're shared, when they're acted on, and when they're linked to decisions. And I think that's where care becomes practical, Hunter. Because leadership is not what we intend, as Steve and I were just referring to. It's not what we intend, it's what people experience. And the same is true for every organization.
Nice. Thank you.
And as you mentioned, Andrew, the questions have kept getting tougher. But in fact, we've saved the toughest question for last.
Okay.
And so, Doug, would you like to fire away?
Yes, let me fire away. So, Andrew, in this fabulous book of yours, Who Cares Wins, you make the case that absolutely genuine care is the ultimate performance driver in safety and leadership. So as we look to the future, as we move into the reality of the 100-year life, where many people will work 50 or 60 years and move through multiple career stages, what do you see as the next major frontier for safety culture and leadership in the coming century?
You know, Doug, I don't think I've ever really seen my work as being narrowly about safety. For me, safety's always just been a doorway into a much bigger conversation about culture transformation, leadership, value creation, and the conditions that allow people to do great work. Of course, safety matters profoundly, but when I talk about safety culture, I'm really talking about something much, much broader. I'm talking about the climate and the culture and the conditions within an organization that allow people to do great work and to thrive while they're doing it. And so that's why the phrase creating value wins resonates so strongly with me. When leaders create the conditions for people to think clearly, speak honestly, collaborate well, and do meaningful work, everybody wins. Leaders, teams, organizations, customers, and as I said earlier, society at large. And I think it's worth thinking about this idea of the 100-year life. It's a really important part of this conversation. In fact, just recently I was chatting in a podcast with Linda Grattan, one of the co-authors, along with Andrew Scott, of the book called The 100-Year Life. Brilliant book. It's several years old now, but perfectly resonant for today. And I think the 100-year life conversation has had a huge influence on how we think about longevity, how we think about work, how we think about learning, and how we need to think about reinvention of ourselves. And so in the podcast that I had with Linda recently, there was some real synergy in how we both think about these issues. Because, look, if people are going to live longer, work longer, and reinvent themselves more often, and move through multiple chapters of contribution, then leadership development cannot only be about performance in the next quarter. It has to be about sustained human capacity. So we need to prepare rising leaders not just to deliver results, but to understand how energy is built, how it's depleted, and how it's restored. We need to help them understand how trust is created and maintained, how psychological safety enables learning and adaptation. We need to help them understand how to lead through uncertainty without creating unnecessary fear, and how to create cultures where people can truly grow and contribute and keep renewing themselves over time. And that means helping leaders become much more conscious of the environments that they create. Because one of the biggest risks for the next generation of leaders is that they inherit exhausted systems and simply learn to normalize them. They learn that pressure is leadership. They learn that busyness is value. They learn that resilience means absorbing more and more without question. But that's obviously not sustainable. So I think we have to teach rising leaders to ask different questions. Questions like, are we building clarity or confusion? Are we creating energy or are we draining it? Are we encouraging voice or silence? Are we helping people grow or simply extracting more from them? And that's the real leadership challenge here. Because care-based cultures are not maintained by good intentions. They're maintained through the repeated behaviors, the everyday decisions, and the quality of interaction between leaders and teams. So to kind of draw this thought to a natural conclusion, I think the future is not simply about developing more technically competent leaders. It's about developing leaders who can create the conditions for people to think well, work well, adapt well, and live well across a much longer working life. And that's really the core message of Who Cares Wins. It's that care is not the opposite of performance. Care is the climate in which sustainable performance becomes possible.
That's beautiful.
On that note, I'd like to thank Andrew for this amazing journey in depth and breadth of this dramatic change that's happening across the whole economy, where a significant proportion of organizations and thinkers are talking differently and thinking differently and acting differently in the way of which they treat people, not as resources, not as assets, but as people and creating value for them and for others and helping them to create value for others. And this whole podcast series is about identifying those firms, identifying these speakers and bringing those speakers to you and making sure that you have access to that kind of thinking. So we will be holding a podcast every week, and we'll be having the world's leading speakers and thinkers talking about and explaining what's happening on these issues. And in fact, we'll be having next week a podcast with Hunter himself and Mark Packett, who will be talking about venture mode, how firms get into a mode of radically creating new value and looking at what's involved in that, how to make that happen. And that will be a very exciting session. Well, also, we have a website now, Value Creating Wins, about this podcast, and you can go there and see the previous podcasts with Rita and Felix and Johan and the discussion that we had. And you'll also be able to ask questions, because we are raising many, many deep and wide-ranging questions, and I'm sure you will have some of those questions. And in fact, the third segment was dealing with those questions. So fire away your questions to us, and we will be happy to answer them. And in fact, we have a conference later in the year, September, where we'll be bringing these speakers and thoughts and ideas and insights all together in a single 2 days, September 22nd and 23rd. And we hope that you'll join us there. So thank you for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you next week in our session and in the further podcasts and the conference later in the year. And thanks again to Andrew and Doug and Hunter for putting on such an incredibly deep and wide-ranging and profoundly provocative session. Thank you.
Thanks for such beautifully curious questions. I very much enjoyed being with you.